Debashish, Banerji, thank you so much for being with us for our blog and vlog and upcoming podcast, Posthumans. It's such a great honor and pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you. I would also like to thank today Julian Boilen, co-director of the podcast and also co-director of the vlog. So thank you so much also, Julian, for being with us today. It's a great honor and joy to work with you as well.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you. All right, so if you have heard of Debashish Banerji, you already know how amazing he is. And if you have not, you definitely need to know more about his work. So I'm going to read a short biography and really advise you to look more into his work and also his videos and books. So Debashish Banerji is the Haridas Chaudhuri Professor of Indian Philosophies and Cultures and the Doshi Professor of Asian Art at the California Institute of Integral Studies, San Francisco, California. His interests lie in postmodern, post-colonial, and cross-cultural approaches to Indian philosophy, psychology, and culture. Banerji has authored and edited several books on major figures of the Bengal Renaissance, such as the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, the artist Abanindranath Tagore, and the spiritual thinker Sri Aurobindo. He's also edited books on critical posthumanism and integral yoga psychology. I also would like to mention that we already had the pleasure and the honor to talk with Debashish about posthumanism, COVID-19 and integral yoga. So definitely look also for that episode with Debashish. Today we're going to talk a little more specifically about posthumanism in relation to, on one side, postcolonialism, and on the other side, in relation to the tradition of wisdom. And here it's really worth to mention that philosophy comes from the Greek terms philos, sophia. Philos means love, and sophia means wisdom. So in this sense, I really see posthumanism not just as an intellectual tradition, not just as an academic tradition, but as a way of thinking that can really change your life. And for me, it's a really great honor to have been knowing and working with Debashish for many years, because he's really one of the few ones who really see and have seen the power of the gift that posthumanists can bring us to our daily existence, not just posthumanism as an academic tradition that is becoming very fashionable. Debashish has been working on this for a long time, and he's really one of the voices within the tradition of existential posthumanism, a really dear tradition also for me. So Debashish, first of all, thank you so much for your really inspiring work, your presence, and your insights to the posthuman community. Your voice has been so, so precious.
Thank you, Francesca. Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you. So, Debashish, I would like to ask you, let's start the conversation for the people who are already interested and a little knowledgeable about the tradition of posthumanism. And the tradition of posthumanism, the first layer of posthumanism, is really the deconstruction of the humanistic tradition. And in this sense, of course, there are some great thinkers that arose out of the Western tradition, although they really go beyond the Western tradition. In the previous interview, for instance, you mentioned someone like Deleuze, who has been really pivotal in the development of posthuman studies. But I think that there are many other traditions that are very precious to the development of posthumanist philosophies, and that sometimes are a little overshadowed by deconstructing Western traditions. So I would really like you to enlighten us about what, for instance, philosophies that come from the Indian tradition of thoughts that are extremely ancient. We're talking about thousands of years before the Common Era, of a tradition, for instance, Advaita, who has so much to resonate with posthumanism. So I would really like to think of the people who are working, for instance, in posthumanism, and why they should look, for instance, into Indian philosophy to get inspired by non-dualistic traditions, etc., etc.
Thank you, Francesca. Firstly, I want to acknowledge your work that really has inspired me. When you talked about existential posthumanism, I really think I cherish all the work that you've done in that area, and the fact that you wrote about that in the volume that I co-edited, as well as we've talked about it for such a long time. And I think it's really something significant, your ability to open up that area in posthumanist studies. So thanks for that. And I wanted to mention, since you
Thank you,
brought this.
Debashish. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we should really think about maybe a book together on this. It's so precious,
Yes.
so precious. And thank you for all your support, insights, all these years.
And yeah, and so when you brought up the contribution of India, for example, I'd say when we are talking about post-colonial cultures and India as a post-colonial culture, what's really interesting is the paradigm of humanism is carried across the world through colonialism. So we find colonialism having this hubris of what's called the white man's burden, which is really to a large extent a humanist episteme that it wants to push across the whole world. And that's when you start seeing the beginnings of post-colonialism in the nationalist discourse that's forced to look back and say, wait a minute, I mean, is this the kind of human that I was? Or is it a construct that's being put on me? And so that's exactly because humanity, as we know it today, has not everywhere asked itself the question, what is the human? Or what makes me human? It's only when a humanist paradigm is really pushed in your face that you start asking that question. And then, because you need to answer, it's an interpellation, as they say. You're being interpellated in a certain voice, and you have to give an answer. And dialogue begins, which, either can go one way or the other. You either become the person who's interpellating you, you get wiped out, or you find the ability to transform the dialogue. So that's really where posthumanism and post-colonial voices come in. That's one way in which post-colonial voices come in. Of course, there's the other way, which is the whole, neo-colonialism that comes out of posthumanism and transhumanism, particularly, that creates new classes. But I think during the nationalist period itself, we start seeing in the Bengal Renaissance, for example, looking back to that's why it's called a Renaissance, looking back to a rebirth of some of the ideas of what it means to be human in the Indian spiritual tradition. And what it means to be human ultimately is that we are capable of a different kind of existence. We can transform ourselves. We can unite with larger forms of consciousness. We can also have resistant, powers. So that's how it begins to some extent in the nationalist period. And today, if we think about yoga in the modern world, we see all the forms that it's taken in the history of the appearance of yoga in the West. Whether you talk about Vivekananda, where yoga was really a kind of a meditative discipline, or you talk about the 60s, where you had a kind of pluralization of yoga. You had Bhakti Yoga, you had Advaita Vedanta, you had many different Tantra, and they all came in different guises. Or today you have, when you use the word yoga, everybody hears the word yoga and translates it to mean the yoga studio culture, So each one of these ways by which the West has assimilated yoga had a beginning in that nationalist arising, the Renaissance, the looking back at what it means to be human and why it's not the same as what it means to be human as the humanist tradition is bringing forth to colonial countries. See? So I'd like to point out, for example, that when we talk about the yoga studio culture, which is really feeding into, to a large extent, the yuppie culture of modernity. I mean, you find people who take it as a fitness exercise. That's all they understand of it. It's to have the body beautiful. Or this started in the early 20th century in India. There was the reinvention of yoga. People look back at yoga really as a resistant device because they were being oppressed and physically dominated by the colonial enterprise. And so they needed to find they didn't have money, they didn't have arms and ammunitions, they had their bodies. And how can the body be made to endure this kind of, the sort of violence of colonialism? And that's what gives birth to the whole hatha yoga or physical yoga culture in India as a resistant form to colonialism, and you may say in an epistemic way as a resistant form to humanism. Similarly, when we think about Vivekananda's appearance in America in the late 1890s, he was talking about yoga really as a epistemic revolution. He was thinking about yoga as a new way of knowing, that we are not restricted to knowing by the mind in a rational way through external devices and measurements and things like that, that we can arrive at new intimacies of knowledge through powers of meditation, powers of telepathy and things like that, extrasensory perceptions and things like that. And even when we talk today about Tantra, for example, the modern West has co-opted it and given it its own flavor. It's become the art of sexual ecstasy. But really, Tantra opens up an entire new anatomy of the human being. It makes us see possibilities of knowledge and of enjoyment and of power that are completely unknown, that we've put walls up for in the humanist tradition. So I think yoga, from that point of view, opens up completely new ways of being human that we can't put the boundaries of our present understanding of the human on. And it gives us new trajectories of the post-human from that point of view.
That is so interesting, and I think that what you just mentioned, it's so precious, especially for a side of posthumanism that has not been studied and developed and embraced enough yet, which is post-dualism, which I think it's really at the core of posthumanism, because we can go post-humanistic, we can go post-anthropocentric, but if we still keep a dualistic mindset, which could be, the dualism mind-body or the dualism West-East or the dualism female-male or whatever we want to think of, then or human machine, we're always going to have some form of discriminations, some form of enclosing our consciousness when consciousness cannot be enclosed. Consciousness is unlimited and constantly unfolding. So I think that what you just, all the tradition that you were just mentioning would be so precious to really enrich the discussion on post-dualism. And I think one of the reasons why the discussion on post-dualism is still lacking is because although posthumanists come, of course, criticizing a lot of the Western tradition, too often stays within the Western tradition. It almost becomes, a rebellion against it, but that is going to become its own prison if that's all it is. And I'm not interested in that at all. So I really, especially for the people who are listening to this, who are also working in these topics, really invite all of you to not only criticize the Western tradition, but really discover many other traditions that can be enriching and that are sources of the posthuman. Otherwise, it's not going to be posthuman, it's post-Western. So it's really important to really see the human in a pluralistic, geographically not centralized way. In this sense, I have another question for you, because it's true that the Indian tradition brings so much, especially for post-dualism. But there is something that I noticed, which is anthropocentrism, that can still be found in many traditions around the world, including some Indian traditions. I've been, searching for, I think, from day one of my life, but I had a fantastic conversations also for many, with a lot of people who come from traditions that are not the Western ones. But something that I keep finding often is this anthropocentric idea. For instance, even I was speaking with, for instance, some Hindu friends and Hindu scholars, and the idea that if you reincarnate as a human, you still consider something very precious because somehow you are really evolved in the, let's say, I don't want to say hierarchy, but in the spiritual realm, being human is considered very precious. more precious than being embodied, reincarnated as a non-human animal. And this aspect, I just never digested that. I don't see the human as more special. I see us as different, obviously, from a tiger or from a pelican or from a snake. But I don't see that we are more advanced from a consciousness level, because I don't see consciousness as hierarchical. So because maybe it's the people who I talk to that maybe their own understanding. But I found this in a lot of tradition, even the Hare Krishna tradition. I see this coming back to the idea, yes, consciousness is everywhere, but still the human, you're very lucky to be a human, and you should really cherish the fact that you were reincarnated as a human. What do you think of this?
Yeah, Francesca, I know that this is a very big issue, and it actually can be very problematic because it is kind of feeding into exceptionalism, as you said. It's tricky though, because I think the idea over here is that not only that the human is sort of exceptional in some way. I think the reason they're saying that most of the Indian traditions is they're talking about freedom of consciousness. And they're saying that basically that's where there is a hierarchism in this idea. I mean, as you mentioned, it's not just difference, it's hierarchism, because if you don't have any boundaries, if consciousness is something that actually can flow between boundaries, then there is some way by which you have to look at it either as completely lateral. That means that there is no kind of development of evolutionary complexity, or you have to look at it as an evolution of consciousness itself. And if the Hindu tradition, there's also very plural. There's many different kinds of Hindu traditions, and some of them are more, kind of aggressively sort of superior. They have more of a superiority sense than others. But I think where the notion of kind of an evolutionary sense comes in is in this idea of the freedom of consciousness. The fact that consciousness is everywhere. Everything is conscious, and nothing is more conscious than anything else. And that's the reason why they say Brahman is everywhere. Even a rock, the entirety of Brahman is the rock. So that has to be first acknowledged. And even the Gita is saying that. The Gita is saying that you have to first develop a certain kind of consciousness in which the Brahmin and the dog and the rock are the same. They're not different at all. But at the same time, they're saying that the freedom of consciousness, to be able to do that fully, evolves. In other words, that's where the whole idea of Purusha and Prakriti comes in, that there is automatisms, that we are machinic to a large extent. But within the machinic consciousness, that there is something that can take more choice or less choice. And that which can take more choice can actually matter in the sense that it can actually transform itself, help others or not help others, hurt others, be more powerful than other creatures, which is what we've done on the earth. So how can we be more responsible about that? And how can we actually become much closer to a multiplicity of forms of consciousness? I think that's where these people are coming from. And, if you look at some of the Western thinkers who also don't want to go in the direction of superiority, like Bergson, for example, or Deleuze, when he actually incorporates Bergson, he's talking about memory, matter and memory, and the fact that human memory, in a sense, can transcend the limitations of our particular sort of experiences, our subjective experiences. And Deleuze uses the term can scramble up the planes. We can go back and forth. So it's not really an exceptionalism. It's more like if we can talk about freedom of consciousness. And I think I'll agree with you that it can still be left as a kind of a question and a problematic area that needs exploration. But I think that there's ways by which we don't need to look at it as a kind of a supremacist idea.
Thank you so much, Debashish. That was such an interesting answer. Thank you so much. Now, I have another question for you. So for me, a philosophy should be, on some level, changing the person who really believes in that. But there are some other traditions, for instance, and thinking some Roman philosophers who were saying, I'm just a philosopher, I think in specific, I think it was Seneca, who was very rich, and he was talking about being poor, and people were asking him why, you are being rich when you're talking about being poor. And he was like, yeah, I'm just a philosopher. Now, I feel that I'm more connected to those traditions. And yeah, if I think of India, I can think of so many masters. And I also can think of Greece, so many people who were really trying to be the philosophies that they were talking about. And with posthumanism, I see posthumanism as that kind of philosophy. I don't see it as something that just people write about, although that's also the case. Now, to me, posthumanism is something that really can change your daily life, from your diet to the way you treat others, to the way you treat yourself, to the way you treat your computer, to the way you treat your technological relations with the machines and with others through the machines. How do you feel about posthumanism? Because I think that on one side, it is a tradition that is coming out of academia. So sometimes maybe people are talking about non-human animal rights, and then, after the conference, they might go to eat at a restaurant having a big piece of steak meat. And I, for me, should also be not judgmental, but I also wonder how can ideas like, for instance, non-human personhood and non-human rights can go together with someone who maybe not applying that to the way they exist. And again, of course, we are many, and there are so many ways to live philosophies. But I wonder if posthumanism is a way of living, or is something that is just being written, or is both, or is neither.
Very good question, Francesca. I absolutely, completely agree with you. As you know, that philosophy has to be lived and practiced. We have to talk about a philosophy of praxis. Philosophy is praxis. And I think, postmodern philosophy largely kind of admits that and moves in that direction, whether we talk about phenomenology, ontology, or we talk about, the various kinds of post-structuralism. It's really about owning up for what one thinks and actually taking responsibility for it and becoming what one wants to become. I think existentialism, we are talking about existential posthumanism, is really about, living one's philosophy. So I completely agree that posthumanism is worth nothing unless one lives it and is practices it. It's a praxis. So I think when we talk about yoga, for example, as feeding into posthumanism, and the question you asked before this was very pertinent. It's not only the exceptionalism of the human, but there's many other things. If we look at the yoga tradition historically, that there are question marks. That there is, the yoga tradition has existed within a caste system, for example, that there are certain classes that had greater access to texts. Of course, you can say that there were people who went outside the caste system, but that's also problematic. In other words, you create a division between society and the outsider, right? So, today we have to look at these as revisionary forms of praxis. We cannot have the same kind of yoga tradition that we had in the past. We can't make the distinction between matter and spirit as Advaita Vedanta does, for example. We have to critique those things and we have to re-assimilate them for our needs today. We have to be ethical in our contemporary sense if we are going to utilize the technologies of the past in a post-humanist manner. So I think that the reasons why we have to look at things like the yoga tradition are completely different from the reasons for which they looked at it at that time, right? And I think some of them have to do with what you've already pointed out, the dualistic thinking, the kind of superiority between man and nature, man or human, and man and woman, human and machine, human and plant, ecology. I think these are all forms of consciousness that we have to enter into relations of intimacy with. And relations of intimacy are blurred boundaries that ultimately can lend themselves to yoga kind of experiences, yogic experiences of identity. I think that's the way in which we have to revision the tradition of yoga in a post-humanist sense.
Thank you so much, Debashish. This has been such an inspiring conversation with you. So, I'm sure that we will need to go on with more projects and developing more this conversation, because they're really so much needed always, but specifically in this moment where it's so clear that posthumanism is not just something we write about, but can really enrich our daily existence, give meaning to it, and really helping us navigate, for instance, this historical situation with COVID-19. So I would like to thank you so much for your time, for your precious insights, for your wisdom, for your presence. Thank you so much, Debashish.
Thank you, Francesca. It's always a pleasure talking to you, because you inspired these ideas, and you're so full of this inspiration to make a difference to the world through the power of posthumanism. So thank you very much.
You're so welcome. And my work has been inspired by people like you. So Debashish, if people want to connect with you and want to write to you or work with you, how can they find you?
Well, I teach at the California Institute of Integral Studies, as you said, and I'm chair of the East-West Psychology Department there. It's easy to find ciis.edu and East-West Psychology within it. And my email is dbanerji@ciis.edu. I welcome any connections. Anybody would like to talk to me or communicate with me, I'll be very happy to communicate with them.
Thank you so much, Debashish. You have a wonderful day, night, whatever time zone you are in.
Afternoon here.
Afternoon. Yeah. So you have a wonderful afternoon.
Yeah.
And we'll talk soon for the next conversation. Thank you so much, Debashish. And thank you so much also, Julian Boilen. Thank you.